You're dismissed, effective immediately. That was the first sentence out of Dylan Crane's mouth, before the damn coffee even hit the table. No greeting, no lead in, no discussion. Just that. In front of the full board, on the first working day of the year, I didn't even blink, just stood, closed the folder I'd brought, and said one word. Thanks. That was it. I didn't shout. I didn't beg. I didn't ask why. I didn't need to. The room was dead quiet. I mean silent, like someone had pulled the plug on the oxygen. Half the directors wouldn't meet my eyes. The other half were glued to their screens like if they stared hard enough, they could delete the moment from memory. Meanwhile, Crane sat there smug, like he'd just won some kind of corporate Hunger Games. He didn't know what he'd done. Not yet. Before we go on, real quick, if you're one of the 97% listening but not subscribed, do us a solid, hit that button, drop a like, and help this channel survive the corporate apocalypse. It takes 2 seconds and keeps stories like this going. All right, back in. It had started months earlier, of course. That's always how this goes. I'd been with Elcaris Holdings for 9 years. Most of it spent quietly keeping the entire infrastructure stack running, while every flashy VP played tech savior in the press. I handled everything from vendor authentication nodes to our mirrored compliance sandboxes across 3 jurisdictions. Our entire cloud operations layer, the syncs, the logs, the flags, the lockdown failsafes, that was mine. Built from scratch, not glamorous, but bulletproof. Then came Dylan Crane. Silicon Valley hair, private equity handshake, PowerPoint soul. They brought him in after the firm got bought out by Gentry Partners, said we needed forward vision. What we got was a guy who looked at a functioning engine and called it duct-taped junk. First meeting, he smirked and said, "This is like running Wall Street on floppy disks." I sat there, deadpan, let him vent. Let the others nod. You learn over time that nothing wakes a fool faster than letting them light their own match. What Crane didn't know, what none of them seemed to ask, was that the system wasn't just patched together, it was complex by design, bound by compliance tethering that had to satisfy dual entity restrictions after the holding company's merger in 2015. It couldn't just be modernized, at least not without stepping into a minefield of regulatory blowback. I told him that. He waved me off, said his consultants had it covered. We'll have legal review everything. That sentence should have sent a chill down his spine, because tucked into the original governance framework, filed back when we were still operating under Elcaris Gray, was a custodianship clause that made me the legal steward of the infrastructure layer. Specifically, Clause 18B, signed. Notarized, approved by the former CTO and General Counsel. You could override it, sure, but only with dual authority. And guess what? Nobody had asked me to sign a damn thing. I didn't push, didn't grandstand. I let Crane believe his own hype, let him bring in his task force. Watch them buzz around like consultants do, dropping buzzwords and writing 6-figure suggestions that boiled down to reboot it all and hope. By December, they were trying to draft a new cloud protocol. I watched from my corner, quiet, logging every change, every conflict, every system hook they misunderstood. It was like watching someone try to hotwire a Tesla with a butter knife. So when Crane stood in that boardroom, crisp January morning, and fired me like I was a temp who'd stolen Post-its, I didn't flinch. I'd already transferred custodianship to a separate legal entity, one they wouldn't recognize, one tied to a trust that used my wife's maiden name and a Delaware shell. But that's the thing about power. When people think they've got it, they stop checking the wires. They assume they've flipped the switch, without ever wondering who installed the breaker box. I left the room slowly, almost politely. I could feel their eyes on my back. Not one of them said a word, not even Crane. Maybe deep down, he felt it. The tension. The kind of quiet that doesn't mean obedience, it means countdown. Because behind that exit, the real work was about to begin. They came in like it was a war zone. Clipboard commandos with startup hoodies and shoes that cost more than my monthly mortgage. Crane's personal task force. Infrastructure Revitalization Initiative, he called it. They preferred Black Ops. And yes, they actually said that in a meeting. I wish I were joking. The lead one, Garrett something, told me they were here to liberate the data layer, like we were storming Normandy, not maintaining uptime across 3 financial sectors and a medical research division. He tapped on a screen, flashed me some dashboard mock-ups with sparkles and drag-and-drop sliders. "This is the future," he said. "We're going to simplify everything." Simplify, that word. They throw it around like a compliment. But in ops, it's code for, we don't know what we're doing, so we're going to burn down whatever you built and act shocked when it explodes. I told Crane, firmly but respectfully, that ripping out the core stack wouldn't just be expensive, it would be catastrophic. Our compliance modules were built on a dual entity framework, Elkiris Holdings and the Elkiris Research Trust, which had to stay legally distinct post-merger. That framework wasn't decoration. It was the only reason we passed the last 5 audits, and the only reason we hadn't triggered fines from the EU, the IRS, or worse, the California Department of Health. Crane didn't even look up from his phone, just flicked through some Slack messages and said, "We'll replace it. Legal's reviewing everything." That was his mantra. Legal is reviewing everything, except legal wasn't looped in. Not the real legal. The old GC had retired. The new one was some equity guy's nephew with a minor in philosophy and a bad poker face. He barely understood that the infrastructure wasn't just code, it was custody. Access wasn't granted. It was licensed, escrowed, bound to a governance clause I'd had notarized in 2016 and revised in 2021 when the Elkiris Research Trust updated its bylaws and renewed its IP rights. That clause, 18B, made it crystal clear. Operational authority and custodial infrastructure controls shall remain in trust stewardship unless jointly released by the originating architect and a governing officer of both legacy entities. I was the architect. They had no governing officer from Elkiris Research, because that branch, it was folded, absorbed, dissolved. The last officer, she was gone, retired to Canada. No signature, no override, and me, I'd moved custodianship. 2 months before Crane's task force started tinkering, I transferred the entire compliance backbone, permissions, escrow, certs, to a Delaware LLC with a new custodian, Solbridge Analytics Trust. Run by an anonymous managing member. Technically, not even me anymore. But the trust? Still mine. You think they asked? Not once. They started rewriting systems, slashing through layers they didn't understand, stripping encryption triggers like they were unused CSS files. Garrett grinned as he said, "We'll just disable the legacy cert triggers. They're over-engineered anyway." Over-engineered? Those triggers were regulatory kill switches. They existed to stop deployment if sandbox flags weren't aligned across regions. Remove them, and you don't just get a bug, you get subpoenaed. I watched them drift further into the quicksand. Gentry Partners was pushing for speed. Crane wanted to look like a genius before Q2. Everyone smiled and nodded while I quietly mirrored their actions, logged every change, and forwarded updates to the Trust's internal review mechanism, an AI-run documentation system that time-stamped every unauthorized attempt to overwrite, reassign, or replace the escrowed certs. Let them keep digging. Let them laugh. Because the minute they committed those changes, they were on the record, triggering liability they didn't even know existed. Clause 18B wasn't just a relic, it was waiting. Like a fuse tucked into drywall, not glowing, not hissing, just patient. The pressure was rising. The storm wasn't coming, it was already here. The chairs were arranged tighter than usual. Classic misdirection. Pack the room, thin the oxygen, make it harder to speak, harder to breathe. I'd seen it before. $1,000 tactic from a 2-cent strategist, quarterly kickoff, but the energy wasn't, let's build. It was, who dies first? The board was there. Finance, ops, legal, though not the real ones, just the polished ones Gentry parachuted in with Crane, and of course, the consultants. Garrett and his little Silicon Valley cabal, sitting smug like they'd won something, as if running half-baked simulations in a WeWork suite qualified them to reinvent the machine I'd spent a decade building. Crane stood at the head of the table, sleeves rolled, chin high. The kind of guy who thinks power is a pose, not a responsibility. He tapped his tablet, made eye contact with no one, and announced, "We're trimming fat." The words hung in the air like nerve gas. Then, "Effective immediately, your services are no longer required." He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. Everyone turned toward me, like it was choreographed. I looked down at the manila folder I'd brought. I wasn't even going to open it, just muscle memory from years of being the one with answers. My pen still rested inside, still clicked in, still warm from my hand. I closed the folder, stood up, looked Crane right in the eye. Thanks. I didn't shout. I didn't ask for an explanation. Didn't rattle off achievements or loyalty or sacrifices. There's no power in proving worth to people who've already decided you're disposable. The real power is walking out while they're still waiting for you to fall apart. He gestured to security like it was theater. Two guys with radios and guilty eyes stepped forward. One hesitated. I gave him a half nod. Don't worry, kid. I'm not making this messy. The walk from my seat to the door felt like crossing a canyon, not because I was nervous, but because they were. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Even Garrett sat still, like he could feel the shift in pressure, like something had cracked in the walls. I pushed open the boardroom door. Silence behind me, not one farewell, not one breath. And that's when I knew. They felt it. Not guilt, not triumph. Doubt. The kind that creeps in right after the applause. The kind that makes you wonder if maybe, just maybe, you killed the wrong queen. What Crane didn't know, what no one in that room seemed to realize, was that my name wasn't just on the badge, it was on the infrastructure. Not metaphorically, literally. Custodial ownership buried deep inside the governance stack. The very one his little purge had just voided without the proper release, which meant all those changes Garrett's team was pushing through. Every line of replacement code, every overwritten cert, legally unenforceable, technically null, operationally radioactive. But I didn't need to explain that, because the moment that folder shut, so did the window. They thought they'd fired a manager. What they really did was eject the only person who knew how to keep the machine breathing, and in doing so, they locked themselves out. It started that afternoon. No dramatic outage, no sparks flying from servers. Just a hiccup, small enough to ignore, but big enough to be fatal. Procurement pinged DevOps about a batch order delay. DevOps blamed the new pipeline. Garrett blamed legacy bleed. Everyone blamed everyone else. Nobody blamed me. I was already gone. By morning, the hiccup turned into something louder. Routing queues failed to clear. The batch ordering system hit a timeout wall because it couldn't verify vendor hashes. Someone tried to force push a new access cert. It bounced. Why? Because the push triggered a lock written to reject single key deployment events. Every DevOps credential routed through two endpoints. One revoked last September when the old compliance officer retired. The other? Still active, still bound, still mine. Crane had no idea that I'd updated the certificate authority schema when the El Kairos Research Division folded. That move, barely a footnote in the operational log, split all core credentials across a dual escrow model, originally proposed for medical data containment. One key sat in dormant escrow set to self-expire if not used within 180 days. That 180 days ran out 2 weeks before they fired me, which meant every control they thought they inherited, they didn't. Without both keys, the compliance layer interpreted all changes as hostile, and in a hostile event, it did exactly what I designed it to do: shut down escalation and revert to minimal secure posture, which meant no deployment, no partner sync, no procurement batch automation, no audit clearance pings to regulatory mirrors. Worse, the system didn't scream, it just slowed. Delays, timeouts, subtle data stutters, just enough to trigger penalty clauses, just enough to make clients nervous. The first panic call hit Garrett mid-meeting, someone from vendor ops asking why billing flags weren't clearing. Then compliance pinged him. 3 flags had been raised on API calls that weren't authorized. Then the auditors called, asking why sandbox logs didn't match timestamp chains. They tried reboots, patch overwrites, even pulling backups. None of it mattered. The structure wasn't broken. It was sealed. Everything they touched routed back to a single cert ID, and that ID still pinged my trust's validation server. Garrett called in a hot fix team. Didn't help. Crane flew in 2 guys from DC, big reputations, loud jackets, even louder promises. They got stonewalled on hour 2. tried to patch from the root, but root was permission locked under a governance tag they couldn't see. And when one of them tried to bypass that tag, the system flagged him as hostile actor Class B. Audit logs recorded everything, in triplicate, with fail-proof redundancy in 2 mirrored servers, owned by the custodial trust. They were locked out, completely, cleanly, legally. They could still see the system, but they couldn't touch it. Watching them spin was like watching toddlers try to solve a Rubik's Cube with mittens. Furious, clumsy, no clue how deep the damage went. What they didn't realize yet, what made it so delicious, was that this wasn't a glitch. It was design. Every fallback they needed had a key, and the only remaining holder of that key was no longer on payroll. The panic finally reached legal. Not the junior associates or the PR compliance puppets Crane liked to parade around board meetings, but the real legal team, the internal watchdogs who had been there long before Gentry's buyout, the ones who still remembered when the infrastructure stack was just a proposal, and I was the only one willing to touch it. They pulled my old file. At first, they thought it was a formality, just checked that I'd signed over the rights when the new architecture plan rolled out. But then they found it. Clause 18B. It was buried halfway through my original custodian contract, nestled between license disclosures and sovereignty provisions. I still remember the room where it was written. 2 partners, 3 laptops, and a legal pad full of contingencies no one else cared about back then. But I did. Framework and access rights remain under trust custodianship unless terminated by mutual signatory authority. Not terminated at will. Not subject to executive override. Mutual signatory authority, which meant the only way to unseat the access core was with 2 signatures, mine and one from an officer of the now defunct El Kairos Research Trust. Good luck finding her. She was retired, living somewhere in British Columbia, gardening and ignoring emails. And me? I sure as hell hadn't signed a release. Worse, so much worse, they discovered the update. 2 months before Crane's revitalization began, I had filed a custodial reassignment under Section 4.3 of the Governance Clause. It was all properly notarized, sealed, time-stamped, and executed through a blind intermediary. The custodianship didn't disappear. It moved to a Delaware LLC registered under my wife's maiden name, not my current name, not El Kairos, not even a human name on paper. The trust was listed as the owner, the LLC as the steward, legally firewalled, ethically flawless, structurally bulletproof. Clause 18B hadn't just been honored, it had been weaponized. I'd told them. I warned them. Gave Crane every opportunity to ask the right questions, to bring in someone who could parse the documents before charging forward like a frat boy through drywall. But arrogance is a poor replacement for experience, and legal couldn't unsee what was already in ink. The board got the news in pieces. First the lead counsel, then the compliance lead, then the CFO. Each call got quieter, tighter. A director apparently whispered, "Please tell me this is fixable." The reply, according to someone still on the inside, "Only if you can unsign a notarized clause and reverse time." There's something glorious about the moment dread sets in, when people realize they didn't just make a bad decision, they made an irreversible one. That folder Crane slid across the table, that smug little execution in front of the board, that was him lighting a match in a fireworks factory, and legal had just found the blueprint taped to the wall. They hadn't removed me from the system. They'd made the system untouchable. Every consultant's line of code, every override attempt, every late-night security breach to salvage access. They were all happening inside a framework they didn't own, couldn't alter, and now couldn't even legally view without triggering breach penalties. And sitting in the center of that framework? A silent trust. No headlines, no names, just a clause, and a woman they'd underestimated one meeting too many. It took 3 days for the outside world to smell the rot. Not insiders, not employees, not Garrett and his crew of slide deck cowboys. I mean the real players, the vendors, the partners, the regulators, the people who didn't care about titles or office drama. They just wanted their syncs to run, their data to match, and their damn fines to stay at 0. But suddenly, nothing synced. Vendor No. 1 called about a data mismatch, said the sandbox logs weren't timestamping correctly. Vendor No. 2 asked why order confirmations were being duplicated, then stalled, then vanished altogether. And then came vendor No. 3, the big one. Global reach, multi-year contract, brutal SLA enforcement. We've logged 3 compliance anomalies in 72 hours, their systems rep said on a call with Garrett. If this isn't resolved by end of week, you'll trigger automatic breach penalties. Garrett said he'd escalate. He didn't know there was nowhere to go. Procurement pipelines had already backed up. Authentication hashes were failing due to the revoked cert, the one they never replaced because, well, they didn't know they needed to. And because Clause 18b made the framework legally sealed, the system couldn't be patched without violating its own logic. That's when the regulators smelled blood. First, it was a quiet inquiry from the Financial Conduct Authority in London. Then 2 emails from the EU Compliance Mirror. Then the big one, an encrypted packet from the California Department of Health, asking why patient timestamp logs from El Kairos Research Division had stalled at 48 hours of inactivity. Those logs were mirrored from my framework. The framework they'd tried to streamline without understanding it was the regulatory spine of 3 parallel jurisdictions. One by one, the external contacts began showing up on Garrett's calendar with red urgency tags. By day 5, a whistleblower from inside one of the certifying bodies leaked a screenshot to a tech compliance blog. It was subtle, just a registry update, but it said everything. Custodial control update filed. V3.7 effective date, 2 months prior, governing trust. Ridgebeam Analytics, DE, custodial entity. Ridgebeam IP Stewardship Trust. Filed by Anonymous LLC, no name, no fuss. Just a silent registration on a platform that regulators, vendors, and competitors all watched. The impact was immediate. Half the partners paused integrations. The other half flagged El Kairos in their risk watch lists. One firm terminated auto-renewal, quietly, professionally, but with unmistakable finality. Inside El Kairos, it turned into controlled chaos. Crane ordered a complete audit of the infrastructure stack, only to discover they didn't have access to perform one. The auditors refused to continue without valid chain of custody clearance, and since Clause 18b rendered every post-termination access attempt invalid, even the audit logs began flagging internal use as unauthorized. Legal scrambled. Garrett panicked. Crane tried to get creative, which in his case meant bluffing confidence while hoping someone else would solve it. Nobody could, because the lock wasn't a bug. It was a boundary, and on the other side of it was me, watching their self-inflicted firestorm spread, wondering how long it would take before they realized this wasn't just a personnel issue, it was a compliance collapse with a paper trail, and I owned the paper. The voicemail started with fake warmth. "Hey, just wanted to talk. Clear the air maybe, I think there's been some confusion." Then came the silence, 3 seconds too long, followed by the tell, that thin hiss of corporate panic hiding under the smile. "Anyway, give me a call. Sooner the better." I didn't call back. 2 hours later, another one. "Look, we're trying to move forward here. If there's anything you need to make this easier for both sides, we're open to a fair conversation." He meant, "Please give us the keys back before the fines hit 7 figures. Then came the shift. No more Crane. Now it was his lawyer. Mine got the call mid-afternoon. Same firm that had shrugged off my custodial documents 6 months ago, back when they were too busy greenlighting Crane's infrastructure revamp to read the fine print. Their message was short. "Your client needs to release the governance framework. We're prepared to draft a mutual settlement if necessary." My counsel didn't even flinch. "Our client is no longer contractually bound. No releases will be issued. Do not call again unless it's in writing." And that was it. The door shut. The panic began. That same week, I saw the headline. Quiet, tucked in a Monday morning compliance update feed. Praxis Edge Solutions files. Custodial notice for new hybrid compliance stack custodian, Ridgebeam IP Trust. It wasn't flashy. No marketing blitz, no product launch, just a single legal filing. But the industry noticed, because Praxis Edge, El Kairos' loudest competitor, the one Crane had mocked as third-tier tech with a second-rate roadmap, had just declared full regulatory readiness using a model almost indistinguishable from the one I'd architected. And the custodian? My trust. Ridgebeam, same LLC, same Delaware shell. Same digital signature chain Crane tried to erase. Only this time, the doors weren't locked. They were wide open. Praxis Edge got the full package: hybrid jurisdiction mirroring, automated audit trail embedding, timed cert sandboxing. Everything Elcaris had tossed aside in their scramble to look modern. But here's the difference. Praxis Edge listened. They didn't fight the system. They adopted it. Quietly, legally, contractually airtight. Crane didn't just lose his infrastructure. He lost the future he was pretending to build. He hadn't just fired the architect. He'd outsourced the blueprint. Now his rival was running the playbook he hadn't bothered to read and doing it under full compliance coverage, backed by a trust structure no one at Elcaris could access, crack, or even question without triggering disclosure penalties. And me? I wasn't even on payroll anymore. I wasn't in the building. I wasn't in the org chart. I was just a name behind a trust. Unlisted, unreachable, unbothered. Because while Crane was leaving voicemails, I was writing the future, off stage, in ink, with a better partner. They scheduled the emergency meeting for 6:30 a.m. Not because it was urgent, but because shame prefers the dark. Crane arrived late. Not drastically, just enough to make it obvious that he'd rehearsed something in front of a mirror. His tie was looser than usual, hair not quite camera-ready, and that smug glint he normally wore around the board table, gone, replaced by something twitchy, hollow behind the eyes. The boardroom was quiet, but not empty. Everyone was already there: legal, finance, operations. Even the interim CTO flown in overnight from Seattle sat stiff-backed with a folder in front of him labeled in bold letters, Access Audit Summary, Unresolved. Legal took the floor. Without full reinstatement of the original custodial cert and compliance access chain, she began, Elcaris Holdings will default on 6 critical contractual obligations. We estimate 11 days before cascading failure begins. Vendor termination clauses will trigger automatically. Insurance coverage could be impacted within 72 hours due to unvalidated audit trails. No one breathed. She tapped the screen. Slide 1, breach fines pending, 1.6 minutes. Slide 2, infrastructure, sync failures, confirmed. Slide 3, custodial chain of authority, Ridgebeam Trust, unrevoked, inaccessible. A director finally broke the silence. Dylan, did you even read the legacy covenants before you signed off on the infrastructure overhaul? Crane tried to speak, but it wasn't even a word, more like a wheeze. He reached for his water, knocked the cap off, fumbled it, left it there. The chairman stood. All he said was, "You dismissed the license holder during a live session?" Crane's lips moved. Nothing came out. Legal didn't wait. She closed her laptop with precision, looked directly at the chairman. He owns the core. It wasn't an opinion. It wasn't a theory. It was a legal fact, documented, filed, immutable unless reversed by the very 2 people who hadn't signed a single release document. One retired in British Columbia, the other not in this room. Why weren't we informed? Another director asked. We were, said legal. 3 times, each flagged and buried, twice by Dylan, once by Garrett. The CFO rubbed her temples. What happens if Ridgebeam refuses to release the access? Legal just blinked. They already have. Someone coughed. Someone else swore. The interim CTO stood, muttered something about redundancy, and left the room without asking permission. What Crane didn't realize, until this very moment, was that it was never about technology. Not really. Not to the board, not to the investors, not to anyone who mattered. It was about control. And he'd lost it. Not through sabotage, through ego, through assumption, through treating the architect of their compliance spine like a disposable middle manager. And now that middle manager held the keys to every door they were trying to force open. Crane looked around for support. There wasn't any. The chairman sat back down. Meeting adjourned. No vote needed. The verdict had already been delivered, and all that was left now was consequence. It landed on a Tuesday. No fanfare, no headline blitz. Just a quiet little press release tucked into Praxis Edge's investor relations feed, welcoming our new VP of Systems Strategy. No picture, no quote, no name. But those who understood the game didn't need one, because 30 minutes later, a separate filing appeared in the U.S. Tech Infrastructure Custodial Registry, a database few people outside compliance circles ever bothered to read. But for the ones who matter, It might as well have been a shot across the bow. Custodial layer IP licensed via Ridgebeam Trust. 7 words. That was all it took. And just like that, the puzzle came together. Every stalled compliance update, every mysteriously perfect sandbox alignment Praxis Edge had rolled out over the last week, every silent system integration that had passed regulation with 0 hiccups. This was the engine behind it. The framework Crane had tried to rip apart, the one he never understood, the one he had tossed aside while trying to impress a boardroom full of people who, by now, probably couldn't remember why they hired him in the first place. Elkaris stock dropped 22% by close of business, not because of the press release, but because investors understood what it meant. Praxis Edge now owned the fastest-growing pre-certified compliance infrastructure on the market. And Elkaris? They had Garrett and a whole lot of breach fines. Crane submitted his resignation that Friday. For personal reasons. The internal memo was brief, empty. No apology, no ceremony, just a timestamp and a black-suited assistant collecting a badge. The board didn't object, because the damage was done. Not just to the company, but to the illusion that they were the ones in control. They weren't. They never were. Clause 18B was never revoked. Never challenged, never touched, because no one had the authority to touch it. And me? I didn't go back, didn't gloat, didn't email anyone a link to the filings or the press release. I didn't have to. The system spoke for itself. Clean, silent, legally bulletproof, powered by precision.